So everyone, welcome back to this new video. And in this video, this is part 4 in a series of 4 videos going over everything you need to know for Edexcel's A-Level History Paper 2, and specifically Route D, the unification of Germany. And in today's video then, we're going to look at Prussia and the Kleine Deutschland solution, 1866 to 71. So this is a quick glance at the specification, just quickly looking at everything we are going to be covering today. So feel free to pause the video here if you'd like to take note. But then moving on then, let's have a quick introduction over everything we're going to cover today. Up to 1866, the European powers had only exerted mild influence on the German Confederation. The situation at the end of the summer of 1866 was very different. The possibility of a shift in the European balance of power was of interest to Britain, who regarded European stability as central to her trade interests. The question of German unification had been answered by the Kleine Deutschland solution by the virtue of Prussia's victorious armies over Austria. The 7 Weeks' War had gone far better than Bismarck could have expected, yet Bismarck realised a punitive peace with Austria just to create instability. He realised, as was the case in Italy, unification would be incremental and not be achieved in a single broad sweep. The potential unification of Germany caused alarm in Paris and with Emperor Napoleon III. The Germans had the potential for growing more powerful than France, and thus it was in France's interest to make sure power was checked as early as possible. What was the significance of Prussia's role in Germany between 1866 and 67? Let's first then look at the Treaty of Prague. Having won the 7 Weeks' War, Prussia held a powerful position but did not want to force too harsh a peace on the Austrians, as this would invariably cause a renewal of the fighting at a later date. On this basis, the Prussian delegation, led by Bismarck, met their Austrian and Italian counterparts in Prague in August 1866. It was accepted by both sides that Prussia was now the leading state within the Confederation, and that it was Prussia's will that would prevail. The Austrians were completely excluded from German affairs as the Confederation was abolished by the treaty. 5 days before the treaty was signed, Bismarck engineered a new military alliance which was to pave the way for further developments and that would lead to the creation of a new state. The North German Confederation was an agreement between the states of northern Germany to cooperate on military matters by the underlying understanding that it was a precursor to a federal state. The treaty was lenient on the other combatants, however. Austria was expected to pay war indemnities to Prussia, but crucially did not lose territory to a northern neighbour. In the end, Austria had to give Venice to the French, who in turn then gave it to her Italian allies. And here, this is then just a quick map of the North German Confederation and exactly who and where it encompassed. And obviously, as you can see from that picture on the right, it obviously was completely dominated by Prussia. The annexation of the northern German states. Though Bismarck was anxious to tread carefully, he was keen to stamp out anti-Prussian sentiments in northern Germany. The major states of the north who had fought against Prussia were lost and annexed as part of the Prussian Peace Treaty. The one exception, however, was Saxony. Potentially the most powerful of Prussia's German enemies, Saxony had developed a corps of 32,000 to aid the Austrians, which had fought at the Battle of Sadowa. Bismarck could have deposed the King of Saxony and annexed his lands as he did to the King of Hanover, but Bismarck was reluctant to have too many dispossessed monarchs loose in Europe. Moreover, as Saxony bordered Bohemia, it was strategically important. The Prussians therefore invited Saxony to join the North German Confederation, which means that the King of Saxony would retain his throne and Saxony itself would have some notion of equality with the Prussians. Thus, Saxony obviously accepted. So let's then have a quick look at the North German Confederation itself. The treaty that established the North German Confederation as a military alliance stipulated that if no agreement had been reached to establish a German federal state by August 1867, then the treaty would expire. As the Prussians, which might have seen as an advantage in slowing down the process, had already been annexed by Prussia, Bismarck was able to proceed with optimism. Bismarck began drafting a new constitution in late 1866. After negotiations, it was accepted in April 1867. The North German Confederation had become a federal nation with Bismarck as its chancellor and Wilhelm as its head of state. The Reichstag itself is an indication of Bismarck's flexibility in his approach to politics. The victories over Denmark and Austria had made Bismarck a national hero by 1866, and this result saw the Liberal majority in Parliament reduced from over 100 to a mere 6. Bismarck believes that patriotism would be even firmer among the workers across the North German Confederation. The Reichstag of the new North German Confederation was elected by universal manhood suffrage, which meant that every man over the age of 25 had the ability to vote. The makeup of the new Reichstag was not quite what what Bismarck would have wanted. A hung lower house consisted 1/3 of conservatives, 1/3 of liberals, and 1/3 of anti-Bismarck delegates. The Reichstag, however, was only the lower chamber of the Confederation's parliament. The upper house was the Bundesrat, or Federal Council. The structure of the Bundesrat had been decided by Bismarck, and having control of the Bundesrat and the monarch gave Bismarck an automatic veto on any legislation. On the face of it, the North German Confederation was the most liberal constitutional monarchy in Europe. This was, however, more a veneer of liberalism than anything actually substantial. The Reichstag in reality had very little power. The military budget, which amounted to 90% of the federal expenditure, was in the hands of the Chancellor, not the Reichstag. The Reichstag was merely limited in its ability to stand in Bismarck's way. Prussia's relation with the South German states. Ideally, Bismarck would have wished to incorporate the South German states into the new Germany. He was, however, aware of France's increasing alarm at the possibility of a new German superpower within Central Europe. However, Bismarck was aware that in 1866 and 67 the time was not right to go to war with France, and he had also been mindful of the need for rapprochement with Austria, which he considered a necessary ally to maintain stability. Though Bismarck had taken great pains to keep Austria intact, the internal situation was anything but stable within Austria. Hungarian nationalists had not forgotten the War of 1849 and still resented the imposition of rule from Vienna. Negotiations began at the beginning of 1867 and reached an agreement in the spring. The Austro-Hungarian Compromise, as it became known, was ratified by the Austrian Parliament in May 1867. What the compromise laid out was internal independence for Hungary. It would have its own parliament and its own budget. Franz Joseph would be crowned King of Hungary, but this was an entirely separate position from Emperor. This arrangement became known as the dual monarchy, which would last for another 50 years until the First World War. The creation of the Zoll Parliament. As the economic ties which would bound the southern states to the Zollverein became stronger with increased industrialization, it became more difficult to break. A new initiative was launched in 1867. Delegates from the southern states were invited to attend the Reichstag when matters pertaining to the Zollverein were being debated. Similarly, delegates were also sent to the Bundesrat on the same terms. These bodies were seen as separate from the usual organs of North German Confederation and were given the titles Zoll Parliament and Zoll Bundesrat. Bismarck knew that France would never agree to the southern states becoming part of Germany because they would not want a direct border with a larger power. Therefore, the southern states would only be able to join a united Germany after a military victory over the French. Bismarck and the National Liberals. In the first 5 years of his ministry, Bismarck had consolidated the conservative regime in Prussia. He had led Prussia in 2 wars, both of which extended Prussian territory and eradicated the power of 2 other states, namely Denmark and Austria. In the wake of victory over Austria, Bismarck decided that it was time to heal the schism between government and parliament. He granted parliament an indemnity bill, which was in effect an open acknowledgement that the government had acted unconstitutionally. The Progressive Party still held out against Bismarck, but it began to break up as Bismarck now had a solid core of support, centre-ground delegates. As the National Liberals dominated the Reichstag, an alliance with them was to Bismarck's advantage. He gave way on certain issues such as elections by secret ballot or the right to an annual debate on the budget, but he held firm on key issues of ministerial privilege or the right to control the military budget and deciding foreign policy. So then why were Prussian relations with France so important? Napoleon III and Bismarck. Napoleon III was elected the president of the Second French Republic in 1848. After a coup d'etat in 1851, he became emperor of the Second French Empire. In an attempt to make a clear link to his uncle, Napoleon III reformed French institutions. He rebuilt Paris and enlarged the French Empire. In Europe, his foreign policy was proactive and at times aggressive. Napoleon was not ideologically against the idea of German unification. His sense of nationalism was strong. He did, however, recognise that a united Germany would shift the balance of power and not be in France's advantage. When Italy unified, France was given territory in Savoy as compensation. It was rumoured Prussian representatives may be willing to do the same in the event of German unification. Napoleon voiced his concern, but allowed events of 1866 to evolve as the way they did. Napoleon saw foreign policy as his own personal area, and perhaps was more inclined to be led by his heart than his head. Bismarck, also took the lead in foreign policy but conducted himself with opportunistic cynicism. After 1867, Napoleon became ill and had to rely on his advisors more and more, while Bismarck was at the height of his swaggering power. Let's look at this Luxembourg crisis and its significance. The King of Holland, who was also the Duke of Luxembourg, was open to the idea of selling Luxembourg to the French should German unification take place. Bismarck gave the impression to the Dutch that he would not be against the notion. The king, who had little interest in Luxembourg and needed the money, was ready to agree to the scheme. Then in early spring in 1867, Bismarck began to play politics. Bismarck began leaking of the French designs to the German press. He also began making speeches referring to Luxembourg as German and declaring that its surrender to France would be an affront to German nationalism. Eventually, a conference was held in London and was attended by representatives of the countries involved and all European powers. The compromise agreed was that the Prussian garrison should be withdrawn and that Luxembourg's independence was guaranteed by the great powers. For Bismarck, the Treaty of London in 1867 was a triumph. For a small price of moving the Prussian garrison out of Luxembourg, he had completely checked the possibility of France's expansion along the whole of its northern and eastern border. Moreover, he had made appeals to German, not Prussian patriotism. His ability to stir up German national sentiment was an indication of his machinations to build a German nation were working. The Hohenzollern candidate and the Ems telegram. A year after the resolution of the Luxembourg crisis, another issue arose which came between France and the North German Confederation. A revolution in Spain forced Queen Isabella to flee. The interim Spanish government tried to replace her with a member of a European royal house. In February 1870, an offer was made to Prince Leopold Hohenzollern-Sigmaringen, a member of the Catholic branch of the Prussian Hohenzollern royal family. Wilhelm, the head of the Hohenzollern family, was reluctant to sanction the candidacy as he knew the French reaction would be extremely hostile. However, Bismarck persuaded Wilhelm that widening the power base of the Hohenzollern family would be good for Germany. Eventually, following continued pressure from Bismarck and bribes to influential Spaniards to keep up the pressure, both Leopold and Wilhelm agreed. The news reached France on the 3rd of July 1870. The French reaction was heated. A telegram was sent to Berlin asking for the candidacy to be withdrawn. The French ambassador requested an audience with Wilhelm, who was at that moment taking the waters in the spa town of Ems. Wilhelm was conciliatory with the French ambassador. He reassured him of the French friendship, of Prussia's friendship for France, and that he would seek to resolve the situation. Gaumont, the French foreign minister, was not satisfied with Wilhelm's assurance. He instructed the French ambassador to seek a further meeting with Wilhelm and push for further concessions, namely Wilhelm's personal assurance that the candidacy would not be renewed after it was cancelled. Wilhelm refused, feeling his previous assurances had been enough. Wilhelm then sent a telegram to Bismarck outlining the nature of his meetings. Bismarck then removed certain parts of the message and then leaked it to the German press. What he had presented in the German newspapers read as a preamble to conflict. Bismarck knew that the disclosure of the telegram in Paris would cause uproar. Public opinion, backed by the Empress, the government and the army, demanded war, and sure enough, on the 19th of July 1870, Napoleon III declared that the French Empire was at war with Prussia. So then let's take a look at the Franco-Prussian War itself. The fact that it was the French who declared war on Prussia was not lost on Bismarck. Diplomatically, he could play the injured party in all the courts of Europe. Moreover, the French only declared war on Prussia itself, but given the nature of the North German Confederation, this included the other parts as well. And geographically and politically, the southern states were also drawn into the conflict onto the Prussian side. The German army, which was dominated by Prussia, was quick to mobilise, and by the beginning of August 1870, 500,000 troops had been deployed to the French border. The French, who were much slower to organise, could only muster around 180,000 troops around the fortress town of Metz. Unlike the 7 Weeks' War, the Germans did not enjoy such an advantage with their military equipment. Where the Germans, however, did still have an advantage was their heavy guns, including their Krupp artillery or their revolutionary breech-loaded rifled cannons, which were more accurate and had a higher rate of fire when compared to the French muzzle-loaded guns. Due to the speed of their mobilisation, the German forces crossed the French frontier during the first days of August. The French forces retreated to the fortress town of Metz, where they were surrounded and would surrender by the end of October. The strategic A relief force made up of newly formed army led by Napoleon III approached Metz from the north-west. The two sides met at Sedan on the 1st of September 1870. The strategic necessities of the battle played into the German hands, and by midday the battle was over and the French had sustained 17,000 casualties and over 100,000 troops were taken prisoner, including the Emperor himself. In real terms, this should have ended the war. After all, the only professional soldiers who were not taken prisoner were currently surrounded by the Germans at the fortress in Metz. In Paris, however, the attitude was very different. They wanted to continue to prosecute the war and didn't fully accept the scale of the German victory over their forces. So Napoleon III was deposed, the Second Empire abolished, and the Third Republic declared. The war would continue. General Moltke, the general of the German forces, believed the quickest way to end the war was to take Paris. The siege began in late September and was to last about 6 months. The provisional French government was surrounded in Paris, but tried to organise resistance, but with very few troops there was little to be done, and eventually Paris surrendered on the 28th of January 1871 and the war was finally over. And here we have a picture from the Battle of Sedan itself in 1870, and this is widely believed to be the first ever picture of an actual battle. So, yeah, just maybe for reference you can use this. And here is a picture, an artist's illustration in 1878 between Bismarck and Napoleon III when he was taken prisoner. So the significance of the international situation of 1870. The Franco-Prussian War had come at an ideal time for the Germans. The international situation could scarcely have been more favourable. All of the European great powers were unwilling to assist France for one reason or another. France's diplomatic isolation played into Bismarck's hands. Not only could the North German Confederation conduct a war with France without foreign intervention, he also had the South German states on his side. In under a month, the entire French army had been virtually wiped out, which boosted both the Germans' international prestige and their appearance as a serious European power. It now rested on Bismarck's shoulders to unify Germany without provoking foreign intervention. So why did Prussia need to win the Franco-Prussian War? Increased support for German nationalism. For decades, German nationalism had been a force that largely belonged to the middle classes. Pan-German sentiment had been the preserve of the educated and politically active. Nationalism, however, was not simply a statement of political will. Every point of contact between people from different states, where they touch upon a common idea or activity, was feeding into the cause of nationalism. Every tacit acknowledgement of commonality was building a German idea. Movements of popular culture drew it into the masses better than liberal rhetoric ever could. For example, the German Gym Association provided contacts between peoples from all over Germany during the 3 decades in the run-up to unification. Carol societies performed a similar role as German choirs toured around different parts of Germany singing German music. The Franco-Prussian War was clearly a German endeavour and a great German victory. Even before German unification, it was clear that a German force had defeated the French, not solely a Prussian one, and the pride of victory was spread across the entirety of Germany itself. Strengthening of Bismarck's position. Bismarck's power had never been so great and would never be so great again. He truly was at the top of the European tree at this point. He had virtually every European power in such positions that should he proceed carefully, there would be no interference. France had to pay war indemnities for the cost of the war, and the territories of Alsace and Lorraine were to be given up by France and incorporated into a new German empire. The most difficult negotiations Bismarck would have to face would be with the southern German states, and in particular Bavaria. The issue was how would these states be absorbed into a united Germany, and what freedoms would be lost by the governments of these states, and what privileges would remain. Bismarck was aware that this was his moment, but he also was aware that different groups had to be placated to maintain a lasting arrangement. And here is then a picture of what would eventually become the German Empire and its borders. And you can see on the left picture there, in the bottom left-hand corner, that red area of Alsace and Lorraine, which was taken by Germany after the Franco-Prussian War. So the creation of a German Empire. As soon as the French army surrendered at Sedan, Bismarck was able to begin negotiations with the South German states. Eventually, they all agreed to join and accepted unification, and on the 18th of January 1841, at the Palace of Versailles in Paris, Wilhelm was crowned the German Emperor. Liberals within Germany were quick to proclaim the new empire, or Reich. Many saw it as a culmination of a long process by which the nation, which had already existed, was made one by its inherent superiority. It was simply the material domination of Prussian-led Germany over Austria and France. Bismarck's ability to outfox the diplomatic brains of Europe and navigate the affairs of states so skillfully was admired not just in Germany but throughout the world. However, not every German was delighted at the way events unfolded. Some liberals regarded the new Germany as simply Greater Prussia. They were fearful of Bismarck's cynicism and the power of the Prussian army, though in the minority some people felt the ends did not justify the means. Next, let's look at the Treaty of Frankfurt in 1871 and its significance. Signed on the 10th of May 1871, the treaty brought the Franco-Prussian War to an end. There were three main significant decisions contained in the Treaty of Frankfurt. Firstly, the French would pay a war indemnity of 5 billion francs over a period of 5 years, and the territories of Alsace and Lorraine would be annexed by the new German Empire, and the French would recognise the new German Reich under the leadership of Emperor Wilhelm. Bismarck was aware that taking Alsace-Lorraine would infuriate the French. He thought that the humiliation of defeat would be enough to make France an implacable enemy of Germany. Moreover, in annexing these areas, the Germans would be working along nationalist lines. Most of the inhabitants of these areas spoke German dialects and thought of themselves as culturally and racially German. Another of Bismarck's concerns was strategic. In absorbing Alsace-Lorraine, he placed a buffer zone including the Voyer Mountains between France and Baden and Bavaria. Why was Prussia so successful in unifying Germany? Firstly, the role of Bismarck himself. In the 1840s, Scottish philosopher Thomas Carlyle wrote, "The history of the world is but the biography of great men." There is certainly no doubt that Bismarck played a significant role in the unification of Germany. He changed the politics in Prussia and later within the North German Confederation. He freed himself from ideology and was able to pursue policies that would make political gains. His management of European diplomacy through the 1860s created the ideal conditions for Prussia to capitalise on its military victories. It was Bismarck's belief in the idea of realpolitik that allowed him the flexibility to respond to events. He could be ruthless in the pursuit of his goals, such as the annexation of Hanover in 1866 or the bombardment of Paris in 1870, and then conciliatory as he was with Austria after the 7 Weeks' War or Bavaria in 1870. Some have argued that realpolitik is cynical and Bismarck was certainly not above the use of bribes and secret deals to get as he wanted. His subterfuge during the Hohenzollern candidacy involved deceiving those on his own side. One thing we can say for certain is that without Bismarck's willingness to bend, Prussia would not have been able to take advantage of the opportunities in the same way as it did so. Next then, let's look at the military strength. Since the beginning of the 18th century, the army was the monarch's most prized possession. The Prussians took a scientific view of warfare and their staff college was probably one of the most advanced in Europe. Karl von Clausewitz's book On War became a standard for military leaders throughout the world and illustrates a general approach that the Prussians had towards warfare. Technology played a very important role in the victories of the Prussian army. For example, the needle gun outclassed the Austrians in 1866 and the breech-loading artillery outclassed the French in 1870. Also, the expanding and huge network of railways kept the soldiers supplied with ammunition so that they could keep the fighting going and advancing. The Prussians also benefited from the tactical and strategic errors of the opposition. The Austrian conversion to shock tactics after 1859 played directly into the hands of the rapid-firing Prussians and was a significant factor in the Austrian defeat at Sadowa. And in 1870, the French allowed half of their forces to be outmaneuvered into a fortress in Metz where they would sit idle and be useless in the upcoming warfare. Next, economic factors. The strength of the Prussian economy was important in allowing the Prussians to take the lead in Germany. Prussia became the leading industrial state within the Confederation during the 1850s. This allowed it to dominate the Zollverein and control investment in capital projects. The Austrians, however, drained by wars in Italy and Hungary, were struggling to balance the books and thereby did not enjoy the same economic freedoms that Prussia did. When the moment came for army reforms at the end of the 1850s, the Prussian government had the money to re-equip the army with the latest and greatest modern technologies. Now let's look at German nationalism. Tension existed between the idea of German nationalism and Prussian nationalism. How far did people perceive the Kleine Deutschland solution as a united Germany excluding Austria, which was led by Prussia or dominated by Prussia? Was the new Germany in 1781 really Germany or just Greater Prussia? Perhaps a federal state, there was always these tensions between individual states and the nation. The wars of the 1860s gave the nationalists a second chance if they were willing to reframe their thinking. Like Bismarck, they would have to adapt if their sole aim was a united Germany. Mostly forged an intellectual and emotional alliance with Bismarck and were willing to be led as long as they were moving toward their shared goal. Victory in war also helped to raise nationalist sentiments. In 1866 this was not so clear, but in 1870 it was clearly portrayed as Germans winning a German war. Bismarck was quick to use nationalism for his own ends, particularly during the Luxembourg crisis. This wave of popular sentiment, exemplified by victorious troops and marching bands, was utilised by Bismarck as he sought to win over more reluctant factions to the idea of German unification. So then, the internal situation. Ostensibly, the whole of Europe was against German unification. Why would they not be? Who would want to be proportionally weakened by a German superstate? And yet the European powers allowed the process to run its course without intervening. The breakup of the concert of Europe was massively important. Had the system been sustained, Prussia would have been coerced by the other four powers to maintain the status quo. It was the weakness of the Ottomans that proved to be a decisive factor, as Russia was looking to exploit Ottoman weakness to increase its own power. This set the Russians on a path against Britain and France, who saw a strong Ottoman empire as vital to their own strategic interests in the Eastern Mediterranean, and this distracted attention away from the German question. Bismarck very cleverly isolated the countries with whom the Prussians were about to have a war with. Bismarck was also able to use incidents such as the Eames telegram to provoke conflict and appeared the injured party. So, was the revolution from above or was it a revolution from below? The question that has been asked by historians is whether the unification of Germany was a revolution from above or below. In essence, was the change brought about by the will of the ruling elite, or because this was a mass movement which desired it and brought about the conditions which made it happen? The answer, so often as is in the case, lies somewhere in the middle between the two. The case for the revolution from below lies in the causes and the events of 1848, along with the broader social and cultural movements that were prevalent in Germany at the time. The vision of the men of 1848 was, at different times and different places, supported by large numbers. Demonstrations such as the Hypfine Festival indicate this. The failure of 1848 to deliver a tangible outcome was a blow to the nationalist liberal cause, but ideas once sown can't easily be reclaimed. Being genuinely close to the possibility of a unified Germany made the idea a reality for countless of thousands of people. The case for revolution from above is quite obviously clear. The scheming of Bismarck, the weakness of Austria, Prussian manipulation of the Zollverein, and the Prussian victories in the wars against Austrian France are causes of the unification of Germany. The change itself was so significant in the way that it altered the balance of power in Europe that the only way to push through change was at the point of a bayonet or the muzzle of a needle gun. Understanding this, Bismarck manipulated situations that allowed him to exploit Prussian military success to the end of unifying Germany under Prussian rule. Of course, the two extremes of revolution from above and revolution from below have a strong relationship. The potential outcomes of the wars should always be considered with the progress made in cultural unity. The impact of the meetings of exercise clubs or the singing of Bach is unmeasurable, and yet without them, how would the German psyche have developed? How far could the armies of Prussia have swept all before them? Political change can be forced in the short term, though, the power of weapons, but it can only be sustained when the masses of the people are prepared for it. Cultural unity, along with the debates in the Frankfurt Parliament concerning the nature of Germany, have prepared the ground for Bismarck and von Moltke. Great men, as with great events, can perhaps only be born of their time. So, that is all the content we've covered, so let's quickly go over the specification to make sure we've covered everything. So, we've looked at Prussia's role within Germany, the Treaty of Prague, the annexation of the northern German states, the North German Confederation, and the Zoll Parliament and Bismarck and the National Liberals. We've then looked at Prussia's relationship with France, Napoleon III and Bismarck, obviously the significance of the Luxembourg crisis, the Hohenzollern candidacy, and the Eames telegram. We've then looked at the Franco-Prussian War itself, including increased support for German nationalism, strengthening of Bismarck's position and the creation of a German empire, and the significance of the Treaty of Frankfurt. And we then finally looked at reasons for Prussia's success. So thank you very much everyone for watching. As mentioned, this is the fourth part in a series of 4 videos covering everything we need to know for Route D for Edexcel's A-Level History Paper 2. I've done the exact same video for Paper 1, and in the future I'll be doing the same video for Paper 3. Also, if you are studying A-Level Politics or Philosophy, I've also got videos on those subjects that you'll hopefully find helpful. So again, thank you very much for watching.